Well, it's good to be with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. I'm glad you're all tuning in. Today we're going to be looking at why the post-tribulational view concerning the rapture is unbiblical. I'll be doing at least two parts, perhaps even three. So we got a lot to cover. Let's get started straight away. The real issue with the post-tribulational view, to me, fundamentally, is that you would know exactly when Jesus Christ is coming. And that's a problem because Jesus himself promised in Matthew 24:36 that no one knows. Later in Matthew 24, verses 42 through 44, Jesus says that he's coming at an hour that you do not expect and at a day that you do not expect. Okay, well, the problem with that regarding post-tribulationalism is you would know exactly when he is going to return. Now, why do I say that? Well, think about it. If you see, for example, the abomination that causes desolation, you know that the Lord Jesus is going to return 3.5 years later. I mean, literally 1,260 days later, he destroys the Antichrist with the splendor of his parousia. That's what he's going to do. Now, I want you to think about that then. The post-tribulation position would lead believers to know exactly when Jesus Christ was returning. That's unbiblical. Now, how do we know that, in fact, once the Antichrist sets himself up in the temple, that Jesus is coming 3.5 years later? Well, we know that from many texts. For example, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, it said this. It says, "He shall speak words against the Most High, and he shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given," by the way, the they there are the believers, particularly those in Israel, "they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time." So the Israelites are going to be given into his hand for 3.5 years. That's what a time, times, and half a time means. A time would be a year, times would be 2, and then half a time is obviously a half, so it's 3.5 years. Now we see the same idea when we get to the book of Revelation. Revelation 11, 2 through 3, here we have John being given basically data about the measurement of the temple. And notice what he says. He says, "But do not measure the court outside the temple." He says, "Leave that out." This is the angel telling him that. He says, "For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Now stop there. The 42 months is 3.5 years. And what's going to happen is when this temple is restored, it is going to end up having the Antichrist set himself up in it at the midpoint, declaring himself to be God. You read about that in Daniel 9:27. You read about that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. What the Antichrist will do is he will cause an abomination because he will be declaring himself to be God. And he will cause an end of their sacrificial system. And so much like Antiochus Epiphanes IV did in the 2nd century BC, we have this future Antichrist is going to do the same thing. And notice at that time, the Gentiles are going to be again treading upon the temple, that is the temple of the Israelites, for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. That's the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. Now, notice also it says, "And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." So the 2 witnesses that God has ordained, a Moses and an Elijah-like witness, there's 2 of them, are going to be doing what? They're going to be witnessing during the same time period. Now remember in Matthew chapter 17, Jesus at the Mount of Transfiguration, remember the Transfiguration is a foreshadowing of the parousia. It's a foreshadowing of Christ's return. So it's a foreshadowing of this time period. Remember who was up on the mountain with Jesus? Well, of course, he had Peter, James, and John. But remember, Moses and Elijah were there. Does everyone remember that? Well, lo and behold, they're going to show up again in the last 3.5 years. During the time that the Antichrist is reigning, they're going to be witnessing to the world and really the people of Israel. Okay, now why is that important? Because we know that the Antichrist is only going to reign for that 3.5 year period. What's more, when we get to Revelation chapter 12, remember, there's where we're kind of given a preview of what God is going to do in the future, but he also shows us what he's done in the past. And so in Revelation 12, he talks about the woman, which is Israel, the child, which is the Messiah, and I think probably the Messiah and the church, and then you have the great dragon, which is Satan, aligned with the nations. Now notice here, Revelation 12:6, it says the woman, that's Israel, fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for what? 1,260 days. So what's going to happen is when the persecution comes upon Israel at the 3.5-year mark, God is going to bring them into the wilderness for 1,260 days. That's the last 3.5 years. And it's at the end of it that the Messiah will come and destroy the Antichrist and establish his kingdom. So whether it's Daniel 7:25, whether it's Revelation 11:2-3, Revelation 12:6, or Revelation 13:5, we know the Antichrist is going to reign for how long? For 42 months, 3.5 years. Notice it says, the beast, that's the Antichrist, was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Again, that's what Paul is teaching us as well in 2 Thessalonians 2:8, when he talks about the man of lawlessness being destroyed at the end of this 3.5-year period, at the end of the total 7 years. But the focus is on the 42 months because that's the time period in which Israel is going to be undergoing great persecution. So think about it. The first 3.5 years, there's relative peace for Israel, but there's warfare over the world. That's the beginning of the birth pangs. That's when you lose 1/4 of the earth's population. And it just gets worse from there. At the midpoint, the Antichrist breaks some agreement that he has made, and that ushers in what's referred to as Jacob's distress from Jeremiah 30, verse 7. And it's during that 42 months, 3.5 years, that Antichrist reigns, and yet he will be destroyed as the Messiah returns at the end of the 70th week with the church to destroy the enemy surrounding Jerusalem. Okay, now why is this important? Because think about it, dear ones. When Jesus says no one knows that day and hour in Matthew 24:36, well, if you're a post-tribulationalist and you believe the parousia is only a singular day and it's going to happen at the end of the 70th week, well, you would know precisely when the Messiah is returning. After all, you know that he was revealed here at the beginning. When the nations gave their allegiance to him, you had the great apostasy. Well, then you would know that the Messiah is 7 years away. What's more is inside the 70th week, you're going to have warfare that leads to 1/4 of the earth's population dying due to sword, famine, pestilence, wild beast. Well, once you see those things, you would know that he's less than 7 years away. Once you see the abomination that causes desolation, as Jesus foretold of in Matthew 24:15, you would know that he's exactly 1,260 days away. So how could Jesus say that no one knows when he's coming? If you're a post-tribulationalist and you saw those things, you would know precisely when he's coming. That's the problem. And so all of a sudden, now you know precisely when Jesus is going to return. All right? Now, let's keep going. Let me show you some more data. Again, Revelation 13:5, it's very clear that the beast is going to reign for 42 months. When does it begin? Well, it begins at the abomination that causes desolation. That's what Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24:15. Well, then he's going to reign for 3.5 years until Christ returns and destroys him. So you would know the moment you saw the abomination that causes desolation, 1,260 days later, the Messiah returns. Well, is that what the Bible's teaching? Can we know the day and the hour? Well, of course we can't. And by the way, when Jesus says no one knows that day and hour, that day is referring to the day of the Lord and the hour of trial. It's referring to the entire event. And 4 or 5 different ways, remember, Jesus says no one knows. No one knows. But in post-tribulationalism, you would know. So remember, a contradiction is something where you have an absurdity. You can't have someone knowing when Christ is coming and not knowing when Christ is coming at the same time in the same relationship. That's a contradiction. The Bible's teaching something different than what post-tribulationalism is teaching. Okay, think about this. 2 Thessalonians 2:8, Paul says, and then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his parousia, his coming. Now remember, the coming is all laid out in the next slide again, is the entirety of the 70th week. I know some of you are new to my eschatology channel. I'll be proving that. This term for coming is the term parousia. It is the technical term regarding the 70th week of Daniel, which is the coming of Christ. It begins with him rapturing the church. It ends with him coming with the church to establish the kingdom of Israel. The point that I'm raising here in 2 Thessalonians 2:8 is that lawless one is going to be destroyed at the appearance of his parousia. What that means is, remember, the entirety of the 70th week is the parousia. This has to do with the end of the parousia. Okay, well, that's exactly, this lawless one is the beast. How long does the beast reign? For 42 months. Where does it begin? At the midpoint. How is he going to be destroyed? At the appearance of the parousia. But again, the parousia isn't a single day. It happens here. Why is that important? Because if you saw the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist is going to set himself up in the temple, declare himself to be God. You could literally look at your watch or your calendar and say 1,260 days later, Messiah comes. Why? Because that's when he's going to destroy him at the appearance of his parousia. Now, the post-tribulationists will say, aha, that's clear. It proves our point. Here we have the parousia. There's only one day. It's one parousia. And that's when the Messiah is going to return and destroy the Antichrist. It has to be at the end. Well, I would agree that it's at the end of the 70th week of Daniel that Messiah destroys the Antichrist. But the problem is, the parousia, the term for coming, the noun that's being used, is referring to the entirety of the 70th week of Daniel. So you can talk about the first part of it, the last part of it, or anything in between, and it's all part of the parousia. That is critical, and I'll show you that's a primary misunderstanding that the post-tribulationists have. Post-tribulationists say the parousia is one day, when in fact it's a complex event. Okay? But again, how do you reconcile Jesus saying no one knows when he's coming, when if you saw the abomination that causes desolation, you'd know precisely when he's coming? Again, that's irreconcilable. There's no way around it. How do you get around that? How can you not know if you saw the abomination that causes desolation? Well, you'd know exactly when he's coming. 1,260 days later, Jesus is going to come. All right? So let's compare the post-tribulationalist view that says, hey, we can know when we see the abomination that causes desolation when Jesus is returning. Well, Jesus says in Matthew 24, 42 through 44, he says, therefore, stay awake, and I'll talk about that term in later messages. Gregareo means to be found in the faith. If you're a believer, what do? You act like you're a believer. Okay, you act in obedience, and therefore what? It shows that you believe. Okay, so if you're out carousing and you're living for the devil, it may be evidence that what? You don't believe. Therefore, you're not awake, you're spiritually what? You're asleep. Okay, and again, we're saved by faith alone, we're not saved by works. But if we really are saved, our works will show it. Ephesians 2:8 through 10, for by grace you've been saved through faith, not of yourselves. It's a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. But remember, verse 10 of Ephesians 2, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for what? For good works, which God has prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. In other words, good works will flow from saving faith. If you don't have saving faith, your lack of good works will show it. So if you're not staying awake, if you're spiritually asleep, then whenever Jesus comes, it's going to be bad for you. So that's why he says that. Therefore, Gregareo, stay awake. Why? For you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So notice the reference to both the day and the hour. Remember, Matthew 24:36, jot that down. If you're a note taker, jot it down. Matthew 24:36, Jesus says, now concerning, remember, peri day, that day and hour. That, no, watch me, that day, remember he says this in Matthew 24:36, now concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Well, now he's saying the same thing. Well, if you're a post-tribulationalist and you see the abomination that causes desolation, you know exactly when Jesus is coming. You do know the day. It's 1,260 days after that, the Messiah comes. So, therefore, we have a contradiction in the scriptures between Matthew 24, verse 42, which says you don't know what day he's coming, and post-tribulationalism, which says you will know what day he's coming. How can you know what day he's coming and not know what day he's coming at the same time in the same relationship? Dear ones, it's a contradiction. That's clearly what you have if you're a post-tribulationalist. Okay? That is a big problem. Dear ones, post-tribulationalism leads to knowing the day Christ is returning. The Bible teaches that no one knows the day that Christ is coming. That's a big problem, and there's no way to reconcile it. That's the way it is. Jesus says in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, he even says, let the reader understand. So he points it out to everyone. You know when that happens, 1,260 days later, he returns. Post-tribulationalism really, in some sense, mocks what Jesus says in Matthew 24:36, or what he says here in Matthew 24:42 through 44. When Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour, they say, oh, we really can. We really can. Don't take that seriously. Well, I'm going to take it seriously because the Lord said it. So if you have no idea when he's coming, if he's coming at a time, notice it says that you do not expect. How could you not expect it? In fact, if you see the worst tribulation that the world has ever seen, when you see a third of the oceans turn to blood, a third of the ships be destroyed, more than a fourth of the earth dies due to sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts, when you see a third of humanity die due to a 200 million demonic horde army, and then you see the abomination that causes desolation, and you know that 1,260 days later the Messiah is returning, how could that not be at a day and an hour that you don't expect? I mean, come on, let's be better readers than that. So of course, post-tribulationalism then is a $3 bill. Right away, I couldn't in good conscience hold to it. All right, now let's keep going. We know that the parousia is not a singular day. That is one of the big problems that the post-tribulationalists have. They believe the parousia is a single day at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Again, the term parousia is the noun that's often used for the coming of Christ. The term parousia itself means coming, but it also can denote presence. What I'm claiming is that the parousia is actually the entirety of the 70th week of Daniel. It's a complex event filled with many days. Now, as I assert that, you might be asking, well, where's your biblical proof for that? Well, I've shown this in numerous messages that I've done, but let me show again. Luke 17:26 is an eschatological passage. Here, Jesus was teaching his disciples about the end, and he says this. He says, just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days, plural. It's a plural form of hemera from the Greek, of the Son of Man. So what Jesus is saying is that when the 70th week of Daniel comes, it's going to be like the days of Noah. What about the days of Noah? Well, life went on as it always had. They were eating, they were drinking, they were given in marriage, as Jesus says in Matthew 24, and all of a sudden, sudden destruction came upon them. Okay, that's going to be the way it is in the days, plural, that is the 70th week of Daniel. Now, why do I say the days here is referring to the 70th week of Daniel? Well, let me build my case. Notice Jesus says the same thing in Matthew 24:37. Please don't glaze over. If you're groggy, get a candy bar. Okay? Get some coffee because this is important. You're going to learn something here. Matthew 24:37. Notice Jesus says, for as were the days of Noah, notice the similarity, so will be the parousia, that's the term in Greek, parousia, of the Son of Man. Now, what I want you to see is these texts are identical in the Greek, except notice here Luke records Jesus using days plural, but Matthew uses parousia singular. What we can conclude from that is that the singular parousia, which is the coming of the Lord, there's the term parousia, that's the coming of the Son of Man. That's the reference. Son of Man, by the way, is a reference to Daniel 7. It means he's the Messiah. You could say the coming of the Messiah. Okay? So the coming singular is synonymous with days plural. Does everyone see that? Let me show you in the Greek text. This is the Greek text of Luke 17:26. It's tes hemeres tu huio tu anthropou. Okay, what in the world is that? Well, notice this is a plural. What do we really have is a definite article, and then hemeres is the definite form of days. Okay, so it's literally the days plural of the Son of Man. Huio is the Son. You have a definite article before that and a definite article before anthropo, which is, you hear the root for anthropos, which is man. So it's the Son of Man. So you have the days plural of the Son of Man. Now, why am I taking this right from the Greek text? Why am I nerding out on you? Because I want you to see how identical these are. Matthew 24:37 here. By the way, I'm taking it from this point on where you see in the red, the days of the Son of Man. Notice here the coming of the Son of Man. That's what I have in the Greek here. That's where I'm bringing it in. So notice here the Greek text, Matthew 24:37. Notice here the Son of Man is identical. Does everyone see that? You have the Son of Man, the Son of Man. The only difference in the two texts is you have the plural, the days, and the singular, the parousia. What we can conclude from that, don't glaze over this. If you don't see this, you're always going to be wrong in eschatology. The singular parousia is a plurality of days. It's not a one-day event. So right away, it shows us why the post-tribulationalist is off. They believe the parousia is a single-day event at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, when in fact, it's a plurality of days. And when you unpack it, you find out that the plurality of days is synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. So whether it's the rapture of the church, which is actually at the beginning, or it's the destruction of the Antichrist at the end, it's all part of the parousia, the complex event, which is filled with many days. The days plural is synonymous with the singular parousia. Okay, now something else we can conclude, since the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 is about the 70th week of Daniel. Now, let's stop there. How do we know that Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, is about the 70th week of Daniel? Because Jesus says it is. Matthew 24:15, he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, let the reader understand. What's he referring to? He's referring to the midpoint where the Antichrist sets himself up in the temple and declares himself to be God. He also says in Matthew 24:21 that there'll become upon the world such tribulation such as never occurred nor ever will, meaning it's the worst time period ever. Well, the worst time period ever isn't in the church age, and it's obviously not in the millennial kingdom, which is one of perfection for the people of God as we reign with Christ on the earth after the 70th week. So obviously the worst time period is what? The 70th week of Daniel. So from Matthew 24:15 and verse 21, we know that he's talking about the 70th week of Daniel. But we also know he's talking about the parousia. Why? Because the parousia is used in Matthew 24:3, Matthew 24:27, Matthew 24:37, Matthew 24:39. Therefore, the parousia is in fact the 70th week of Daniel. That's the data that we have to have. The entirety of the 70th week of Daniel is the parousia. So whether you're talking about the beginning of it, the middle of it, or the end of it, it's all the parousia. That's the idea. Okay, now that's going to pay off dividends, as we're going to find out. Let's get into how the post-tribulationists misread the Olivet Discourse. I want to show you what they do. Remember, you're reading the Olivet Discourse, and you're getting toward the very end. You're looking at the final battle at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Now, how do we know that in Matthew 24:29? Well, because Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days. One of the most important interpretive issues that every scholar, every Christian has to wrestle with is, what does Jesus mean by those days? If you believe it's referring to the church age, and you think that's what those days refers to, you'll always be wrong in eschatology. What he's referring to are those days of the parousia, the 70th week of Daniel. How do we know that? Because again, he said in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, that's here. It's not something in the church age or at Christ's first coming or prior to Christ's first coming. It's obviously in the last 7 years at the midpoint. So the tribulation of those days is in fact that 7-year period. And notice he says immediately after. There's no time gap. It's immediately at the end of it. What is he describing? Well, he says the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven. Stop there. Why is that important? Because he's referring to the same battle that Joel chapter 3 is referring to. Why? Because in Joel 2:31 it refers to the sun, moon, and stars being darkened, just as Jesus is referring to here. That's the final battle in which God will bring all the nations against Jerusalem, where the Messiah is going to intervene. That shows us this is at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Notice here, you're coming to the final signs. You have the cosmic signs, the sun, moon, and stars are going to be affected. The powers of heavens will be shaken. And then he says in verse 30, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. So there's the Messiah. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and with power and great glory. So what's the clouds of heaven? That's a reference to Daniel chapter 7, where the Messiah rules and reigns upon the earth. Okay, well, notice verse 31, it says, and he will send out his angels with a great trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn this lesson. As soon as you see its branch become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gate. So let's stop there. Verse 31 gave us the last sign. You're going to have this great trumpet call. He's going to gather his elect, which is, you're going to see that's a reference to gathering the elect into the kingdom of Israel at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. I'll prove that to you. It's not a reference to the rapture. That's what the post-tribulationists misunderstand. That's a reference to the ingathering of Israel. I'll prove it to you. I won't just assert it and go on. I will prove it to you, but let me take some time here. That's what's going on. Verse 32. Now he says, hey, it's just like when you see a fig tree and you see its branches become tender. Well, then you know what? Summer's near. In the same way, when you see all the signs in the 70th week, you know what? You know that he is near. Okay, well, why is that important? Because Jesus says, when you begin in Matthew 24:36 on, you have no idea when he's coming. You have no idea. Notice what he says, verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What's the point of that? He's talking about the assurity of his promises. All of a sudden we get to verse 36, and there's peri day, construction marker, discourse marker that shows us Jesus is switching topics. Now he's going to be answering the first question, when will the 70th week be? When will it come? And notice he says, no one knows. Peri day in the Greek, now concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Let me explain my point. What you have in blue up to verse 35, all the way to here, is Jesus is talking about signs. He's answering the second question first. What is the sign of your parousia? That was the second question. Hear me closely. The second question the disciples ask are, what is the sign of your parousia? What is the parousia? It's the 70th week of Daniel. What does Jesus give you from Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 35? He gives you tons of signs. They're all inside the 70th week of Daniel. There's not one of them in which he's referring to something that's occurring in the church age. Now, as I say that, people say, well, wait, Eric, we've always had wars. Not like this. The opening wars kill a quarter of the earth's population due to sword, famine, pestilence, wild beasts. The earth has never lost 25% of its entire population due to warfare. But we will in the opening salvo of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, the earthquakes are far more severe. You're going to have whole topographical changes to the earth after these things occur. You're going to have a third of the earth, the sun, moon, and stars affected. You'll have a third of the ships destroyed. A third of the oceans will turn to blood. All of that's going to be happening inside the 70th week of Daniel. Jesus gives you tons of signs. What's more, in Matthew 24:15, he says, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation, that's here. But all of a sudden you get to verse 36. Now Jesus is answering, when does this whole rascal come, the whole 70th week? Notice he refers to it as that day. Notice you have the demonstrative pronoun akanos. Akanos doesn't simply say the day, but that day. Well, what day? Is it a 24-hour day? No, he's referring to the broad day of the Lord. and the hour is synonymous. It's the hour of trial. Remember in Revelation 3:10, because we keep his word, he will keep us from the hour of trial that comes upon the whole world. Well, he's not talking about a 60-minute time period. He's talking about the hour of trial, the day of the Lord. That's what he's referring to. So regarding then the entirety of the 70th week, that day and hour, it's the day of the Lord and the hour of trial, what? No one knows. You have no idea when this thing is going to begin. Not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Okay, so what he's talking about is the beginning of the 70th week. Now here's the error of post-tribulationalism. They don't see peri day, the discourse marker, showing the change of topic. So what they do is they read all the way through this, all the way through verse 36, as if Jesus is still talking about the end of the 70th week. But in verse 36, Jesus has switched. He's given you a discourse marker. Does everyone understand? He's changed topics. Okay, so if you don't agree with me, you're disagreeing with grammar. You're disagreeing with grammar. Hear me. You're disagreeing with grammar. It's a discourse marker. How can you disagree with it? It's grammar. That's all it is. Okay, so if you don't think that Jesus is switching topics, well, then you're not reading the text carefully. What's more, contextually, Jesus gave you sign after sign after sign after sign in Matthew 24, verses 4 through 35, and all of a sudden he's not going to give us one sign from Matthew 24, 36 all the way to verse 51. Why? Because he's talking about the beginning of it. But the post-tribulationalist doesn't see it. It just goes right over their head. So what they do is they read the entire text as if we're still talking about the end of the 70th week. So they'll get to verse 36, now concerning that day and hour. They'll think he's talking about here, when in fact he's talking about here. He's talking about the beginning of it. And that's what accounts for the difference, where here you can know these things. You can know that Jesus is near if you're living inside of it, because you'll see the signs. But all of a sudden he switches to verse 36, you have no idea. No one knows. Well, you can't know and not know at the same time and in the same relationship. That's a contradiction. Okay, if A, then not non-A at the same time, the same relationship. Jones, post-tribulationalism is a contradiction. Okay, and this is why for years I couldn't make any sense of the Olivet Discourse myself. Because I thought, how can Jesus tell us that we can know, but then all of a sudden we can't know? That doesn't make any sense. What alleviates the problem is when you see the discourse marker. When you realize that Jesus is switching from talking about the signs inside the 70th week to the beginning of the 70th week in verse 36. All of a sudden it's like, well, of course. Of course, yes. If you're inside, you'll see all these signs. Then you'll know when the end is coming. And you'll need to know that. Why? If you live during that time period, let's say you're born or you're not a believer and you enter into this, you become a believer in the 70th week, you're going to need to know these things to persevere. Okay? But prior to it, you have no idea when it's coming. It's like the days of Noah. It's like a thief. It's like a man on a journey, and the slaves and the people of the household have no idea when he's coming. Those are all the imageries that Jesus gives us. Okay? So that's one of the problems with post-tribulationalism. They're not reading the text well, looking at the discourse marker showing the change of topic. Jesus answers the second question, what are the signs of your parousia? But then he switches, verse 36, right here, peri day. Now he's answering the first question, when will these things happen? What things? Well, the things of the 70th week of Daniel. And what does he say? No one knows. You have no idea when the thing begins. You have no idea. No one does. Not the angels of heaven. So why are the post-tribulationalists saying that this is the rapture here when you would know precisely when that would occur? You would simply see the abomination, then you'd count 1,260 days, and you would know precisely when Jesus is returning. You would have a contradiction. But if you read it the way that I'm suggesting, looking at the discourse marker, looking at the context, then you realize, oh, no one knows the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. That's now the topic in verse 36. That's the issue. Now, let me show you this. I've shown, some of you have seen this ad nauseum, I realize, but we have new people checking in all the time. So let me show you what this chiasm is. Matthew 24:3, Jesus with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. Notice the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your parousia, there's coming, and of the end of the age? Remember, they thought the end of the age would be synonymous with Christ coming as parousia. So it's really one question at the end. So you really have two questions. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign of the parousia? Okay, so what Jesus does is, first of all, here's the first question. Let me just show you the structure. When will these things happen? That's the first question by the disciples. What will be the sign of your parousia? Remember, the parousia and the end of the age are synonymous. So that's the second question. Jesus answers the second question first. Matthew 24, verses 4 to 35, Jesus answers the second question. He gives you sign after sign. There'll be wars and rumors of wars. There'll be earthquakes and famines. You'll see the abomination that causes desolation. Upon the world become such tribulation such as never occurred nor ever will. Unless those days be cut short, no flesh would survive. Then you'll see the sun, moon, and stars. He brings you all the way through the 70th week of Daniel. He gives you sign after sign after sign. And all of a sudden he gets to verse 36, and he says, now concerning peri day, what's he answering? He's answering this question. When will these things happen? That is, when does the entirety of the 70th week come as a whole? That is, when is the beginning of it? And you have no idea. 4 different ways he says you have no idea. It's like a thief. Does a thief give you a precursor prior to him coming? Of course he doesn't. That's the structure of the Olivet Discourse. The post-tribulationalist isn't seeing that. They're just reading right through verse 35, right on into the end, and they don't see the change of topic. And therefore, they take the beginning of the 70th week that's here, and they muddle it with the ending of the 70th week, which is in verses 29 through 31. That's the problem of the post-tribulationalists. They're blending the beginning and the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay? All right. So let me just show you how clear this is. Again, I've said numerous times that not only does the peri-day discourse marker show a change of subject in Matthew 24:36, but the context does. Okay, if you don't like grammar, you don't like any of that, just look at the context. Watch the signs. All of them in blue. I'll show you all the signs. Matthew 24, 5 through 6, you have false Christs. You have warfare. Remember, there'll be wars and rumors of wars. Jesus says there'll be many who come in his name declaring that he is the Christ. Right? So these are all the beginning signs inside the 70th week of Daniel. There'll be famines. There'll be earthquakes. These things are the beginning of birth pangs. The term birth pangs there, odin in the Greek, Paul uses it referring to the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. The day of the Lord comes suddenly like labor pains. Okay, that's a term right from the Greek, odin, same term, right? And it's borrowing right from Isaiah 13:8, which talks about the labor pains associated with the day of the Lord. Okay, well then he gives you more signs. You'll be seeing people given over to tribulation and death. This is towards the end of the 70th week. Then what happens is many will fall away and betray one another. There'll be false prophets. Lawlessness and love will grow cold. Verse 13, but the one who endures to the end of what? The end of the 70th week of Daniel. They're the one who will be saved. That is the one who doesn't give their allegiance to the Antichrist. The one who is in the faith. Verse 14, the gospel then will be preached, that is to the whole world. Then the end will come. That the end of what? The 70th week of Daniel. Now, how do we know the gospel is going to be preached inside the 70th week of Daniel? Well, Revelation 14 tells us. Revelation 14:6, let me cite it. I have in my notes. Revelation 14:6, it says, then I saw another angel flying directly overhead with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. An angel in heaven is going to be flying, flying in the sky, proclaiming the gospel to those who dwell upon the earth. The phrase, those who dwell upon the earth, is used 11 times in the book of Revelation. It always refers to the unregenerate. So God is going to be proclaiming all the way through the 70th week of Daniel the gospel. Whether he uses humans or even angels, the gospel will go forward. But then the end will come, where the Messiah sets up his kingdom. Okay? Well, then what happens is he's brought us all the way to the end of the 70th week. By way of recapitulation, he brings us back to the midpoint. Okay? So from verse 5 all the way to verse 14, you've gone through the entirety of the 70th week of Daniel in just, huge sweeping movements. right? He's giving you all these signs, but now by way of recapitulation, Jesus brings you back to the midpoint. When you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the reader understand. What's he doing? He's brought you back to the midpoint. And now he focuses on the great tribulation. There's going to be great tribulation such as never occurred nor ever will. In fact, if those days not be cut short, no flesh would survive. It's the worst ever. Now he's focusing on the last 3.5 years. There's going to be false signs. There's going to be lightning. Remember, the Son of Man will be one who returns as if there's lightning. In other words, you can't miss the 70th week of Daniel. It's so overwhelming, you can't miss it. It's going to be obvious. Then he comes to the cosmic signs, the sun, moon, and stars, and then the Son of Man himself. This is the last battle at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. So he's gone from the midpoint to the end again. So from verse 5 all the way to verse 14, he brought you from the very beginning of the 70th week to the end. Then he goes by way of recapitulation, he goes back to the midpoint, and he brings you through the last 3.5 years again, and that's where it ends, with the return of Christ to set up his kingdom. Then what you have in Matthew 24:32-35 is the olive tree. Hey, when you see olive tree put forth its leaves, you know that summer's near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you know that the Messiah is there. He's near, right? Why? Because you're inside the 70th week of Daniel. Then he gives you a summary, and the summary is, hey, heaven and earth may pass away, but my words never will. That's the application for the church, the certainty that indeed Christ is going to be faithful to his word, that all the things that were foretold in the book of Daniel and in the Old Testament prophets are going to come about. Jesus is affirming that. His word is going to happen. Okay? Well, then all of a sudden in verse 36, now he switches to answer the first question. Remember, he's answering the second question. What are the signs of your parousia? He gives you sign after sign after sign. All of a sudden, Matthew 24:36, peri day, literally rendered now concerning. That's the discourse marker. Now concerning that day and hour. That day what? The day of the Lord. The 70th week of Daniel. He says no one knows. You have no idea when it's going to come. He says, I don't, neither do the angels in heaven. Okay? Well then, you get to Matthew 24:37-39. He says it's like Noah's day. Why is Noah's day so important? Because life was going on as it always had. But all of a sudden Noah was removed and then the wrath came. So why is that important? Because now he's talking about the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Isn't it interesting? Noah was removed, then the wrath came. In Luke 17, Jesus uses Noah being removed, then the wrath coming. But he also uses Lot being removed, then the wrath came. So the idea is at the beginning of the 70th week, the people of God like Noah or Lot are going to be removed, then the wrath will come. That's the grand point. Matthew 24:40-41, in case you don't understand his point, he says there'll be two in the field, one will be taken, paralambano, and one will be left, aphemi. The term left there, aphemi, is the term that's used for the abandonment of the temple to judgment one chapter earlier in Matthew 23:38. Do you think that Jesus is going to use the same term for the salvation of his people that he just used for the judgment of the temple in Matthew 23:38? One chapter earlier, Jesus is using left for the destruction of the temple. He says, I leave to your temple desolate. And there's a lot of people who say, well, now that's being used for believers. I don't think so. What's more, in John 14:18 in the upper room, Jesus says, I will not leave you, literally abandon you, aphemi, as orphans, the same term that's used here. So of course the one who's left is abandoned to judgment. The one is taken, paralambano, is received to Christ. The same term is used in John 14:3, where Jesus says, remember, I go to prepare a place for you. I will come again, and I will come again to paralambano, to receive you to myself. That's the same term as taken. So the one that's taken is raptured. They're received to Christ. The one who's left is left to judgment. People say, oh, no. The enemies were swept away. No, that's not the point. Noah was taken away in the ark. The others were left to judgment as the waters came upon them. Think about Lot. Lot was taken out, and the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were left for the fire and brimstone. Remember, whatever Jesus says about Lot is the same point he's using regarding Noah. Noah and Lot are not two different analogies, they're identical analogies. So if you think that Noah was just brought through the waters, you're not reading well. Was Lot just brought through the brimstone? No. Jesus says, read it. Luke 17:30-33. Read the text. He was removed on the day he left, the wrath came, the fire and the brimstone. Well, that's the same point that Jesus is making regarding Noah. Noah and his family removed, then the wrath came. That's the idea. The one who was taken is removed. The one who's left is going to be experiencing the wrath. There are those who are the ones who dwell upon the earth. That phrase used 11 times in Revelation chapter 6 to 19, always referring to the unregenerate. How many times does it refer to the unregenerate? Each time. They're the ones who are left to experience the wrath of God. Dear ones, this isn't that hard. Now, let's go to Matthew 24:42. Gregareo, therefore stay spiritually awake. How are you going to be spiritually awake? You're found in the faith. You believe. If you believe, you act on it. Remember, faith without works is dead. If you don't act on it, it means you don't really believe. So you're not carousing, going around drinking as the unregenerate do, doing all the sinful things the unregenerate do. You're going to be found in the faith. Why? Because you don't know. You have no idea when he's returning. It's like the thief who you have no idea when he's coming. It's like a man who's the owner of a home and he's gone. You have no idea, right? That's the idea. You have no idea when he's returning. Okay? All right. Now, notice Matthew 24:43. You don't know. It's like a thief. Now, let's just do a contrast real quick. Does anyone see any signs here? Does anyone see any signs at all? No, you had all the signs were here. Wow. Not a single sign that he's shown us. He doesn't say, so when you see this, so when you see that, watch out for this. He never says any of that. Notice he says in verse 43, you have no idea. It's like a thief. The term for thief there is kleptes. Kleptes is a thief that uses stealth. Lastes is a robber or a thief that uses like a club to beat you over the head with. They use force. It's not lastes, it's kleptes. Kleptes uses stealth. Now, why is that important? Because the beginning of the parousia, the beginning of the 70th week comes like a thief. You have no idea. Does a thief give you a precursor saying, hey, by the way, I won't break into your home until you see my blue Chevy in your garage or in your driveway? Well, of course they don't say that. They don't give you a precursor. You have no idea when they're coming or if they're, well, in the case of the Lord coming, we know that he is coming, but we have no idea when he's coming. Okay, so the idea, that's the idea of a thief. You have no idea. Where's the sign of a thief? You don't have one. Okay, well then he says in Matthew 24, verse 44, he comes at an hour that you do not expect. Now, why is that important? Well, because remember in Matthew 24:36, he says, no one knows the day or the hour. Hope everyone remembers that. In fact, in Matthew 24:44, he says, therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Okay? Well, then when we get to Matthew 24:45-49, remember he has the analogy of a owner of a household. He's gone. The master is gone. Who's the master? It's Jesus. We are the servants. There are good servants and bad servants. The bad servants are those who are unbelievers. And the idea is if you're a wicked servant and you mistreat the other servants, it means you're mistreating Christians. It's evidence you don't believe. And therefore you're going to be assigned to the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. The idea is if you're a good servant, you're going to be doing what the Lord has commanded until he returns. Why? Because you have no idea when he's returning. All right? So that's why he says in Matthew 24:50, he says he's coming on a day that you did not expect. Let me cite to you Matthew 24:50. He says, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour he does not know. Now, why is that important? Notice here, he comes on a day that you do not expect. Notice Matthew 24:44, he comes at an hour you did not expect. Why is that important? Don't glaze over. Get it. Matthew 24:36, what does he say? Now concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Well, that day, remember, he's very specific. What day? Well, the day of the Lord. That's the 70th week of Daniel. You have no idea. He says this over and over. So where are the signs? Where are the signs in Matthew 24:36 all the way to verse 51? Where are they? Well, of course, they don't exist. By the way, the one who's the bad servant, they're going to be being thrown into the lake of fire eventually, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay? So again, all of this is because, and I know this is really small, but if you have good eyesight, you've been eating your carrots, you'll be able to see this is the chiastic structure. Remember, two questions. When will these things happen? What will be the sign of your parousia? Jesus, Matthew 24:4, all the way to verse 35, he answers the second question. There's all your signs. All the signs are here. All of a sudden in verse 36, notice there, right here, peri day, he begins to answer the first question. When does the 70th week come? Notice there's not a single sign, not one. Show me one. There's not one. Well, that proves that he's switching topics to answer the first question. When? When does the 70th week come? You have no idea. So if you don't see this chiastic structure, you'll never get the Olivet Discourse right. You'll never have your eschatology right. I know that sounds bold, but it's just true. I'm just using grammar and I'm using context. If someone can show me a sign from Matthew 24:36 through 51 that we should look for, I'll repent. Show me one. Show me a sign that we are to look for. I can say, hey, there's many signs here, but there's not one sign here. Wonder why that is. Could it be because the peri day really is a discourse marker that shows us a change of thought? I think it is. So now if we read peri day as it should be and we read this structure, now we're reading grammatically, we're reading contextually. If you don't do that, you're not reading well. How many of you would like it if you wrote a letter and you had a paragraph break and someone 100 years later took your paragraph break and they just disregarded it? They said, who needs that? And they just made up. That's what people are doing with the Word of God. Why? I don't know. I don't know why they do that. I can't get into the motivations or the head of everyone, but what I can tell you is I've never seen one single message on all of YouTube where they talk about peri day. Not one. Why? I don't know. But they're not telling you that. But it's in the text. Look it up for yourself. Okay? All right. Let's go on to another post-tribulational problem. They're misreading, again, the Olivet Discourse. So let me show you. What I'm showing you is everything in blue has to do with the signs. Okay, and I'm not going to read this whole thing. I've already read it to you. But notice everything that you see in blue on the screen from Matthew 24. Again, I can't put everything on the screen, but notice in verse 29, right? Verse 29 would be in this section, right? In this section here, the signs. So from Matthew 24:29 all the way to verse 35, you're in this section here. In particular, verse 29 to verse 31, it's looking at the very end of the 70th week of Daniel, right in here. But all of a sudden you get to verse 36, notice there should be a paragraph break. That's why I indented it. That's how it's intended to be read. Now concerning peri day, that day, what day? The day of the Lord. The 70th week of Daniel as a whole. He's talking about the beginning now. Now concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Now he's brought you back to the beginning. When does this whole thing begin? The whole 70th week begin? You have no idea. But notice again, what the post-tribulationalist is doing is they're blending everything in blue with what you have in red. So they're taking what Jesus intends to refer to the end of the 70th week, and they're blending that with what he intends to regarding the beginning of the 70th week. That's what they're doing. They're blending it. So you don't see any of that discourse marker. You don't see anything that shows you Jesus is beginning a new topic, talking about the beginning of the 70th week. That's the problem. So to them, this whole thing is blue. There's no red. The whole thing just keeps going, and you just focus at the end. So Matthew 24:36, to them, it's not about Jesus describing the beginning of the 70th week. It's just still talking about the end. That's the problem that they're making. Does everyone see that? Please, I hope you do, because if you do, it'll be like, oh, of course. Of course that's the error that they're making. All right? Now, I want to deal with this idea of the great trumpet and also the gathering of the elect, because what the post-tribulationists will claim is that the rapture occurs at the last trumpet, and the gathering here is certainly a reference to the rapture. That's what they will claim. And so they'll say, of course, the rapture occurs at the end of the 70th week. What I'm going to show you is contrary to their ideas. By the way, I had to wrestle with this myself. I couldn't understand it for many, many years. So I have a lot of empathy and sympathy. But what we want to do is finally get it right. So how do we understand this? Well, the great trumpet is actually an allusion to Isaiah 27:13. The only passage in the entirety of the Old Testament that uses gadol, shofar, which is great trumpet, is Isaiah 27:13. You might say, okay, who cares? It's a big deal. Because Isaiah 27 is about the ingathering of Israel that'll happen at the 70th week of Daniel at the very end. Okay? Now the term gather there, episynago, also is referring to the gathering of Israel into her kingdom. And by the way, this is going to be our kingdom too. We'll be gathered there. So whereas gather can be used for the rapture, what I'm going to prove to you is that this gathering is focused on the ingathering of Israel into their kingdom at the end of the 70th week. Now, let me begin building my case. First of all, I want to talk about the great trumpet. To what does the great trumpet allude? Again, Matthew 24:29 through 31. Remember in verse 31, Jesus says that he will send out his angels at the great trumpet call and will gather his elect from the four winds from one end of the heaven to the other. The post-tribulationalist rightly says, hey, this is happening at the end of the 70th week. I agree. There's no question. Why? Because the sun is darkened, the moon will not give its lights, the stars will fall from heaven. That's the final battle alluded to in Joel 2:31, which segues into Joel chapter 3, where God brings all the nations down to the valley of Jehoshaphat surrounding Jerusalem, and the Messiah will judge them there. Same battle you read about in Zechariah 14, same battle you read about in Revelation 19. That's where it's going to happen. Okay? But here's the issue. The term trumpet and great trumpet is mega salpinx in the Greek. It's gadol shofar in the Hebrew, the great shofar, the great trumpet. The only time in the entire Old Testament that you see that phrase together is Isaiah 27:13. What's Isaiah 27 about? Well, let's read it. Isaiah 27:12 through 13, it says, in that day from the river Euphrates, that's, remember, in Mesopotamia, to the brook of Egypt, that, by the way, that's the Nile. Now, let me just stop there for a moment. Why is the river of Euphrates and the brook of Egypt, why is that important? Because those are the dimensions of Israel that God initially gave to Abraham. Read Genesis chapter 13, read Genesis chapter 15. You'll see the dimensions of Israel. Those are the dimensions. So this is all about Israel. Notice he says the Lord will thresh out the grain, and he says, and you will be gleaned one by one, O people of Israel. Notice who is it about? It's about the people of Israel. Okay, and he says, and in that day, a great trumpet. Stop there, wake a neighbor, get a skywriter out if you have to, get your Etch-a-Sketch, whatever you need to remember this. The only time, I'll say it again, the only time, let me say it one more time, the only time in the entirety of the entire Old Testament that the term gadol, shofar, is used is right here. And lo and behold, that's exactly what Jesus is referring to. How many times is gadol shofar used, put together in the Old Testament? It's one time. Where does it happen? Isaiah 27, verse 13. And what's it about? Well, notice what it says. In that day a great trumpet will be blown, and those who are lost in the land of Assyria and those who are driven out to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain in Jerusalem. He's going to glean them, literally pick them up one by one, O people of Israel. It's about the ingathering of Israel into her kingdom. They were scattered because of the 70th week of Daniel, but the Lord has returned, and now he's bringing the people of God into the kingdom of Israel. That is what this text is about. It is not a rapture passage. It's an ingathering into the kingdom. Yes, there's going to be a gathering at the rapture at the beginning of the parousia, where the church is brought to heaven. Remember, he says, I'll go to prepare a place for you. And if I prepare a place for you, I will come again to paralambano, to receive you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. That's what happens at the beginning of the 70th week. That's a gathering. But now the term gather, episynago, is being used for the gathering of the Israelites and all of the people of God into the kingdom at the end of the 70th week. That's what it's about. It's not a rapture passage. It's an ingathering into the kingdom of Israel. Now, let me give you further corroboration that this is indeed correct. What does the term gather, episynago, mean? The term episynago, gather, could be a rapture passage, I grant it. That sounds a lot like a rapture passage to me, but it's not. Why? Because we know it's referring to the great trumpet. Here, the ESV, I accidentally put that in there. That's a loud trumpet, but it's the same thing. It's the great trumpet, mega sarpinx, or gadol shofar, right? So that's Isaiah 27:13. What's he going to do? He's going to gather them. What's very interesting is the term gather, episynago, is used in other passages about the ingathering of Israel. For example, notice Jesus says in Matthew 23:37, one chapter prior to the Olivet Discourse, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." Now stop there. Who is Jerusalem referring to? Well, I think it's referring to the people of Israel. Are you with me? What if someone said to you, you're living in, temporarily you're living in Zaire or Zimbabwe or somewhere abroad, and they asked you, what are the people in Washington thinking? Talking about Washington, D.C. Well, Washington, D.C. is a metonymy or a synecdoche, I can never remember which, for the entirety of the United States. In the same way, Jerusalem represents the people of Israel. Okay? So when he's talking about Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often I would have episynago, gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. So episynago, the term gathered, is the same term that's used here. And notice Jesus is expressing his desire, what? To gather the children of Israel. That's the idea. Luke 13:34, same thing. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets, stones those who are sent to it." How often I would have what? How often would I have episynago, same term that's used here, same term that's used here, episynago, gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. When does Jesus say that? He says it back here. Okay, but one day at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, he is going to episynago, he's going to episynago, he's going to episynago. He's going to gather the children of Jerusalem into the kingdom, just as Isaiah 27:12-13 said. So why are post-tribulationists saying it's a rapture passage? Because they got everything else wrong. They got it all wrong. So if you start with the wrong presuppositions, you just stay wrong. That's why the chiastic structure is so significant. If you don't understand the chiastic structure of the Olivet Discourse, you're just always going to be wrong. All right? So what do they get wrong? Well, they think the parousia is one day. What did we learn today? Well, it's actually a complex event synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. Okay? We know that. Now, they also think that the great trumpet is the rapture, but it's actually a reference to Israel's ingathering. How do we know that? Because Isaiah 27:13 tells us. They also think that gather is the rapture, when in fact it's actually Israel's ingathering. Okay, think about the term episynago. That's the verb that's used in Matthew 24:31 for this gathering. It's used a total of 8 times, that verb, in the New Testament. 3 times it's about Jesus longing to gather Israel. 3 of the 8 times. Well, 2 of the references to gather are in the Olivet Discourse that we're arguing about. So now we've just gotten rid of 5 of the usages, and they're not about the rapture. Well, let's look at the other ones. It's one time it's about the gathering of a whole city. Well, that's not what's being referred to. That's not a rapture. One time it's used for referring to people gathering to hear Jesus speak. Well, that's not a rapture. One time it's for the vultures gathered to the corpses that were left behind. Well, that's obviously not a rapture either. The other 2 times that it's used are in the Olivet Discourse. That's what we're debating. That's where it happens here. Okay? Well, I showed you in both instances the context has to do with the ingathering of Israel into her kingdom. Brothers and sisters, episynago is used in Matthew 24:31, Mark 13:27 for the ingathering of Israel. That's what it's about. Okay? All right. Now, someone will say, yeah, Eric, well, what about 2 Thessalonians 2:1-8? Now, what about that? Well, notice in 2 Thessalonians 2:1, Paul says, now concerning, by the way, peri day. He says, now concerning the parousia, that's the technical term for the 70th week of Daniel, the parousia of our Lord Jesus Christ, and are being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, and he says not to be concerned, right? Well, notice here, this term gathered is very much like the verb. It's actually the noun. It's episinage. Okay, episinage is the noun. All right, and someone will say, well, hey, isn't that a reference to the rapture? I think it is. I think it is. It's referring to the parousia, right? That's the parousia. And yes, it could either be the gathering at the end, but it also could be the gathering here. And here I do think it's referring to the rapture. Why? Because he's referring to Christians in Thessalonica are being gathered. I think certainly that's a reference to the rapture. Now remember, the parousia is a complex event. You can talk about the beginning or the end. It's all part of the parousia. Well, here I think Paul is talking about the beginning of the parousia because this is referring to Christians. And yes, Christians are going to be gathered to the Lord to meet him in the air, where we go to heaven and we're spared from the wrath to come. Okay? Now, why is that important? Well, someone will say, hey, 2 Thessalonians 2:8, it says, then that lawless one will be revealed, that's the Antichrist, whom the Lord will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his parousia. Remember, the parousia isn't one day, it's the complex event of the 70th week of Daniel. There, he's referring to the end. That's when the Antichrist is going to be destroyed. Okay? So again, he's bracketed the entirety of the 70th week. The beginning gathering happens here. The end gathering happens here. The parousia begins with the rapture of the church. The wrath comes. The Antichrist sets himself up. He reigns for 3.5 years, but he's destroyed at the end of the parousia. There's no contradiction if you're a pre-tribulationalist and you understand that parousia isn't one day. It's a complex event synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. Remember, Luke 17:26, tes hemeres tu huio tu anthropou, literally the days, plural, of the Son of Man. That's synonymous with the parousia singular of the Son of Man. Parousia singular, days plural. The parousia is a complex event synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, that's another big error that the post-tribulationalist is making. Dear ones, let me leave you with this. Why don't people simply believe Jesus? Think about it. It's so simple. Luke 17:28-30. Jesus says, likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. Life was going on as it always had, just like it's going to be in the church age. Life is going on as it always was. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. He says, so will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. What's he referring to? He's referring to the beginning of the 70th week. What happened? Did Lot stay in Sodom, or did he go out of Sodom? Well, it says he went out. So Sodom was brought out, then the wrath came. Okay? So it's going to be the same way when the Son of Man is revealed at the beginning of the 70th week. Let's look at Matthew 24:37-39. Now remember, according to verse 36, we're talking about the beginning of the 70th week. He says, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the parousia, remember the parousia, 70th week of Daniel, of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage. Life was going on as it always had until the day when Noah entered the ark. Stop there. Notice the point with Noah entering the ark is the same point of Lot leaving Sodom. They're not two different points. They're the same point. The people of God were removed. The people of God were removed. The wrath came. The wrath came. It says, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the parousia of the Son of Man. Why is this hard? The post-tribulationalist says it happens here, the rapture, the removal of God's people. Well, that means you've gone through 7 years of the worst wrath ever. The Bible says you're going to be removed just like Lot and Noah prior to the wrath. Why won't they believe it? Well, because they misread the Olivet Discourse. They didn't see Periday. They don't understand the term parousia. They don't understand the great trumpet. They don't understand Isaiah 27:13, the ingathering of Israel. They're missing these things. So, dear ones, what I can conclude just from what we've learned thus far is indeed post-tribulationalism is a $3 bill. it's not genuine and has nothing going for it. Think about it this way. The worst wrath ever comes upon the world that we're promised exemption from. Well, the post-tribulationalist says, no, you go through it. I debated a woman once on the internet, on YouTube, and she says, no, the coming of the Lord is going to be like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They had to go through the fire. I asked her, where does Jesus cite Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego? No, Jesus cites Lot, and he cites Noah. Lot was removed. Noah was removed. Then the wrath came. Brothers and sisters, it's going to be the same thing. The people of God will be removed. Then the wrath comes. That's clearly what the text of Scripture is saying. Okay? We'll catch you next time on End Times with Pastor Eric.